Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man? They say murder three. Strange things that happen here. How stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?
Back in 1776, someone said, "Give me coffee or give me death." And if that's how you feel, you should be at the Organic Man Coffee Truck. They make coffee the right way, one delicious cup at a time. 4501 McPherson, Suite Number 9. Coffee, the stuff dreams are made of. And welcome to the show. I'm your host, Chris James. Once more, we have Katrini Mackey to thank for tonight's show. She asked me to do something like the Missing 411 books. I have tried to get in contact with David Paulides, but he's a hard man to track down. The one year he went to Jefferson, and I didn't get to go, and he hasn't been back since the times I've been there, don't you know? Kind of like that time I almost got to talk to Smokey Crabtree. I was in the vendors section at a conference, and I was looking over Mr. Crabtree's books when I spotted Nick Redfern by the door. I walked over to talk to him since that was my first encounter with him. I talked to Nick for a few minutes, and then the conference started, so I went inside. When my next chance to get near Mr. Crabtree came, the room was packed, so I didn't even try. Never get another opportunity like that. People go missing all the time. It's bizarre how many people will be unaccountable by this time next year. Would you believe in the time it took me to say that, about 10 people will have been misplaced? Nearly 2 million a year just here in the United States. 800,000 of these folks will be children. Most of the adults choose to vanish, while others simply become a mystery. On a few occasions, the story of the missing person that goes unknown is unexplainable. In 1946, Catherine Van Alst, an 8-year-old girl, was with her family at Devil's Den State Park. World War II had been over for just under a year. The family was staying in a cabin in the woods enjoying the summer. The story goes she was playing with her brothers and somehow managed to wander off. As soon as the disappearance was discovered, her father began searching the woods. When his efforts were unsuccessful, the park officials were notified. Full search parties were brought in, and the whole area around the cabin was searched. When I was a paramedic, I was trained as a search and rescue technician. We were told by the folks who know that most kids don't wander when they become lost. Young kids will almost always find some place to hide and then wait. When looking for young kids, we were told to look under bushes and inside places that small kids can squeeze into. Adults will wander around and wind up making the search 10 times as hard. The searchers looking for Catherine in every place an 8-year-old could hide. Her father was eventually forced to get some rest after he'd worn himself out staying out in the woods for days. As the search party worked the area, they moved farther and farther from the origination point. On the 6th day, the searchers were 30 miles away and 600 feet higher up the mountain. As they called out for Catherine, she suddenly stepped out of the mouth of a cave. Seeing the searchers nearby, she simply said, "Here I am," as if she'd only been gone for a few minutes. She was dressed just the same as the day she had vanished, a simple swimsuit. She had traveled 30 miles through thick brush without so much as a scratch. For 6 days she had no food or water, yet she looked in perfect shape and had no physical ailments. Once she was found, the mystery only grew. As soon as her brothers had realized she wasn't with them, they had started yelling for her. The searchers swarmed the area, but they found no sign of her. She had nothing to say about her mysterious absence for 6 days, acting as if there was nothing to it. Folks tried to explain the mystery away by saying she was chased by some predator and ran to the cave to hide. She ran 30 miles. That's over a marathon. Only a mountain lion on crutches would have allowed an 8-year-old to outrun it. Either that or a bear in a wheelchair. Kids don't consider running away from home until they're about 10 years old. Catherine was 8. She was considered a normal kid, but she had nothing to say about the time she was missing. My wife is a school teacher. Her kids will wear out your ears talking about what they have done and seen. The newspaper article says she got lost returning from the creek and spent the day wandering around, like 8-year-olds will do. She ate berries that she found along the way, and she drank out of streams, and proceeded to walk for 30 miles before finding a cave to sit in. Reading the article, I get the impression somebody was putting words into her mouth. 30 miles barefoot up the side of a mountain in a swimsuit with no physical marks or injuries. This runs right up there with the story of the 3-year-old who went missing from North Carolina in 2019. It was so cold out, the searchers had to call it off. They would pick up where they had left off the night before and continue the search. After 2 days and 2 freezing cold nights, the searchers were looking for a recovery instead of a rescue. When they found the boy, he said he was taken care of by a friendly bear that had kept him warm at night. Freezing cold nights, bears would all be socked away hibernating. If a bear did find a 3-year-old boy, it would have made a tasty snack, not a sleeping companion. What do we have that runs around in the woods and is covered in hair? Something that is seldom associated with killing humans. Maybe a Bigfoot? Both of these stories have a happy ending, yet there are still a huge mystery. Had a Bigfoot-type creature grabbed Catherine, she was old enough to have told her searchers, or at least her family, what she had seen. How did she get so far away with no injuries to her feet or her body? Not all disappearances end with the person or people being found. Off the coast of Scotland sits a lighthouse some believe is haunted or cursed. In the 1900s, there was no such thing as a machine that could run a lighthouse. It took someone known as a keeper to see to it that the light was maintained. Depending on the location, the lighthouse might be run by one person, maybe along with his family. If the place was in a harsh location, there might be a crew of men there to take care of all the emergency equipment. The island of Eilean Mor is a small chunk of land with nothing on it except for the lighthouse. The house was maintained by a 4-man crew that would rotate. One man would be off for the week, and then he would replace one of the others. This gave each man 1 week off, followed by 3 weeks on the island. December 26, 1900, a small ship was making its way to Flannan Island in the remote Outer Hebrides. Its destination was the lighthouse at Eilean Mor, a remote island which was completely uninhabited aside from the lighthouse crew. The Flannan Islands are also known as the Seven Hunters. They were named after Saint Flannan, a 6th century Irish bishop who later became a saint. He had built a chapel on the island, and for centuries shepherds used to bring their sheep to the island to graze. But the shepherds would not spend the night. They were afraid of spirits that haunted the remote location. When the sheep were all removed, the British government built a lighthouse on the remote island in order to let ships know where they were along the coastline, hopefully keeping them from crashing on the rocks. Captain James Harvey was in charge of the ship which was carrying Joseph Moore, the lighthouse keeper that was heading out for his 3-week tour. Joseph was about to begin his shift, and the ship was about to land when Captain Harvey noticed there was nobody at the dock waiting for them. He blew his horn and he sent up a flare, hoping to attract attention. The man Joseph was about to relieve should already be waiting to get away from the island after his 3-week shift. There should also be a man there to help offload supplies that were being sent to this remote location. Joseph Moore rowed ashore and ascended up the steps that led up to the lighthouse. As Keeper Moore was stepping onto the pier, he said he was overcome by a feeling of dread. It felt like something bad was either about to happen or had already taken place. He soldiered on, thinking it was just a lack of a welcoming party that was getting on his nerves. Once at the lighthouse, Moore noticed something was wrong. The door to the lighthouse was open, and in the entrance hall, 2 of the 3 oilskin coats were missing. In a heavy rain, the men might need to run outside. The coats were all the same size, and they belonged to the lighthouse. That way you didn't have to stop and look to see which one was yours. You just grabbed one off the hook and went. Moore continued into the kitchen area, where he found half-eaten food and an overturned chair, almost as if somebody had jumped from their seat in a hurry. To add to this peculiar scene, the kitchen clock had stopped. At the time, clocks had to be wound. If you didn't turn the key after a day or so, the mechanism would run down. Moore continued to search the rest of the lighthouse, but found no sign of the other lighthouse keepers. He ran back to the pier to hail Captain Harvey. When the captain saw Joseph return to the pier and begin waving his arms, the captain dispatched a crew to see what was wrong. The crew from the ship began a search of the island, but they found no sign of the 3 missing men. Captain Harvey dropped a group of sailors on the island to maintain the light, and then he returned to port. He went to the telegraph office to inform the proper authorities of this bizarre occurrence. Lighthouse keepers were under the Board of Trade. Robert Murhead was the board superintendent. He was familiar with the 3 missing men. He'd recruited them, and he knew them all personally. Being a lighthouse keeper was more than just a job. Murhead went to Eileen Moore to investigate the disappearances. Once on the island, Murhead got busy trying to figure out what had become of his 3 men. The lighthouse itself was in good shape. Nothing aside from the coats was missing. Lighthouses, like ships, keep logbooks. Murhead checked all the entries in the book. He immediately noticed that the last few days of entries were kind of bizarre. December 12th, Thomas Marshall, the second assistant, wrote of severe winds, the like of which I have never before seen in 20 years. He also noticed that James Ducat, the principal keeper, had been very quiet. The third assistant, William MacArthur, had been crying. The log of a lighthouse is an official record, and everything that happens that is unusual or noteworthy has to be maintained in it. Once it's down in the log, it's a permanent record of that lighthouse, not to be removed until the lighthouse is decommissioned. What is so strange about a member of the crew crying was that William MacArthur was a seasoned mariner. He was known on the Scottish mainland as a tough brawler, not the kind of guy to become emotional. Why would he be crying about a storm? Most lighthouse keepers were seamen who, for one reason or another, had decided to stay closer to shore. Log entries December 13th stated that the storm was still raging, that all three men had begun to pray. Why would three experienced lighthouse keepers, safely situated on a brand new lighthouse that was 150 feet above sea level, be praying for a storm to stop? They should have been perfectly safe. The walls of the lighthouse are several feet thick. The tower is designed to withstand anything thrown at it. In a storm, there aren't many places better equipped to weather the storm than a lighthouse. Even more peculiar is that there were no reported storms in the area on December 12th, 13th, and 14th. In fact, the weather was reported as being calm. The storm that did batter the island didn't arrive until December 17th, 2 days after the last log entry. The final entry simply read, "Storm ended, sea calm. God is over all." What was meant by that last statement is anyone's guess. After reading the log, Murhead's attention turned to the remaining oilskin coat that had been left in the entrance hall. The area where the lighthouse sat was a cold, wet place. You didn't step outside without a coat. You didn't step outside without a waterproof coat. With only 2 coats missing, someone must have ventured outside. This person would have been drenched and frozen in seconds. If you've never been cold and wet, you don't know what miserable can be like. The rules governing the keepers stated one of the crew was to remain inside on duty at all times. Kind of like how the pilot and co-pilot have to behave. One must remain in his seat at all times. Well, one lighthouse keeper must remain in the tower to be ready for any emergencies. Murhead began to look at all the gear stored on the island. Near the dock, he noticed ropes strewn all over the rocks. These ropes were usually stored in a brown crate 70 feet above the platform on a supply crane. Perhaps the crate had been dislodged and knocked down, and the lighthouse keepers were attempting to retrieve them when an unexpected wave came and washed them out to sea. This theory became Murhead's favorite. It would explain away why the keepers were missing, sort of. Wishing to close the investigation, Murhead put this down as being the official conclusion. The men had all gone outside to secure the ropes and were washed out to sea by a huge wave. This explanation left some people in the Northern Lighthouse Board unconvinced. Why had none of the bodies ever washed ashore? 3 men all washed away at the same time. One, if not all, should have been found somewhere. Why had one of the men left the lighthouse without taking his coat? Mid-December, in the North Sea, it would have been freezing cold out. These men were all seasoned sailors and knew you didn't run around getting soaked and freezing to death. How could all 3 men be washed away at the same time? It was inconceivable for all 3 to be standing in the same place at the same time as a wave came crashing down on them. Where did this huge wave come from if there were no storms reported in the area until the 17th? How could a wave reach the men standing 70 feet above the water? None of the ships passing the lighthouse reported any kinds of severe weather. People on the island of Lewis said they could see the light on the horizon on the day in question, ruling out any kind of a storm that would have obscured the light. With the lighthouse board coming to the conclusion that the men were washed away by a storm wave without a storm, the lighthouse was remanned. The new crew reported hearing strange sounds at night. They say it sounded like voices calling from the dark. Listening closely, the keepers said they could make out someone calling the names of the men that had been missing, as if they were calling to each other in the dark. There was a Doctor Who episode that was based on the Eileen Moore Lighthouse mystery. In Victorian times, the Doctor and Layla arrive at Fang Rock, an isolated crag where something has started killing the local lighthouse keepers. It's a pretty dark story, very interesting. I enjoyed it. Seen it a couple of times, and I've enjoyed it every time I've watched it. The story, Fang Rock, was based on the 1900 Eileen Moore vanishing of the 3 lighthouse keepers. The Doctor was played by Tom Baker. He was the best Doctor in the series as far as I'm concerned. His companion, Leela, was played by Lois Jameson, the best companion the Doctor ever had. She would immediately pull a knife and go into action when threatened. None of that screaming and fainting nonsense. I liked Bill Potts as far as companions went, but she never carried a knife, so she wasn't quite as colorful as Leela. 1927. Barbara Newhall Follett published her first novel, The House Without Windows. It received critical acclaim. What made this so noteworthy was she was 12 years old at the time. Barbara was the daughter of critic and editor Wilson Follett and children's book writer Helen Thomas Follett. She was homeschooled and probably encouraged by her parents to write from an early age. Especially Wilson, her father, had a particular influence on her ambitions as an author. Those around Barbara learned to participate in some of her fantasies. She would tell people that her imaginary characters were in parts of the house, so don't sit on them or interrupt what they're doing. She even went so far as to invent her own language, Farkso, that her characters had used in the book. Barbara was fascinated by sailing. She learned all she could on how to operate a ship and how to navigate. 2 years later, her second novel came out, The Voyage of the Norman D. In spite of her literary success, she suffered several personal difficulties and reportedly became quite depressed. The funny thing about success is, everyone has their own idea on what it is. Me, I think of success as spending less money each month than I have. If there's still cash in my wallet at the end of the month, I did good. The same year her second book came out, her father ran off with another woman. 2 years later, at the age of 16, Barbara and her mother moved to a small New York apartment. They were not receiving any money from Barbara's father. Being the middle of the Great Depression just made circumstances even more difficult. Barbara managed to find a job as a secretary. She had no contact with her father, and even though she kept on writing, she wasn't able to get her subsequent manuscripts published. This rejection caused her to begin to believe she was not a success unless her father made her one. The summer of 1931, Barbara met Nickerson Rogers, an outdoorsman who shared her deep love for nature, and eventually the two got married. They spent their first year of marriage hiking and exploring throughout Europe. Barbara began to suspect that her husband was cheating on her. There was no evidence to support her suspicions, but she began to think the worst of him. She became depressed, which led to her stop writing. She withdrew from contact with friends and family. She became isolated from everyone. She felt as if the two men in her life, her husband and her father, had both rejected her. On a cold December day, reportedly after having had a fight with her husband, she left their apartment and vanished without a trace. December 1939, at the age of 25, Barbara walked out of her apartment, never to be seen again. Oddly enough, it took her husband 2 weeks before filing a missing persons report. To make things even worse, he made the report and subsequent bulletins using her married name. Few people would have recognized her as being Barbara Rogers. To her fans and admirers, she was still known as Barbara Newhall Follett. Her disappearance went mostly unnoticed until nearly 20 years later. In 1966, the press realized that the young girl who wrote The House Without Windows was missing. By this time, the trail was cold and long gone. Today, Barbara would be 104 years old. I'm sure she's no longer with us. The big question is, why did she go? She left home with $30 in her notebook. At least, that's what her husband said. The police never came up with anything to explain where Barbara had went. They didn't suspect foul play, but they didn't really do a lot of digging either. You can still find a copy of her first novel at Amazon, $15 for hardcover. You can also read her letters compiled in a book called Barbara Newhall Follett, A Life in Letters, as well as the last book she wrote, Lost Island. They're not my kinds of stories, but her vanishing is still a very strange thing, so if you're interested, check them out. If you can't read, because your eyesight is so bad you can't focus on the page, maybe you should go by Optica del Norte, 107 Calle del Norte, and get your eyes checked. Stop squinting. It doesn't look good. You look far better with the glasses on than with squinty eyes. If you're hungry, the 1755 Barbecue is the place to be. It's located at the Frontera Beer Gardens on San Bernardo. He's open from 11 to 2 and 6 to 11, Tuesday through Saturday. Gotta help my friends out. They need the business. I covered the Bennington mystery in one of my past shows. This weird story struck me as needing a second look. The small town of Bennington, Vermont, is the site of multiple mysterious disappearances, as in about 40. Between 1945 and 1950, 5 people vanished from the area, which got the area its reputation as being a place of mystery. People began referring to it as the Bennington Triangle. November 12th, 1945. 74-year-old Mitty Rivers went out on a hunting trip. He was guiding a group of other hunters up onto the mountains. They passed the day on the mountain looking for game. Later, on the way back, Rivers had moved ahead of the group. Suddenly, he vanished in the area of the Long Trail Road and Vermont Route 9. The hunting party looked around but could find no clue where their guide had gotten to. During the subsequent search for his whereabouts, a single rifle cartridge was found in a stream. This was the only thing found that might be connected to Rivers, but then how many people went hunting in the area and how many of them might have dropped a shell? Rivers never showed up at his home or in town after that. December 1st, 1946, 18-year-old Paula Jean Weldon, a sophomore at Bennington College, went on a hike on the Long Trail. People recall seeing her walking the trail wearing a bright red coat. Ernest Whitman, an employee at the Bennington Banner, talked to her, giving her directions to the trail. She was seen on the trail by an elderly couple who were about 100 yards behind her, walking in the same direction. The elderly couple saw her turn a corner in the path ahead. When they arrived at the corner, Paula was not in sight. Thinking she might have stepped off the trail, they didn't think anything of the incident until hearing of her disappearance later on. The college sophomore failed to return to campus, causing a search party to form to try to locate her. After weeks of searching, a reward of $5,000 was offered for information on her whereabouts. The reward was never collected. Exactly 3 years after Weldon went missing, December 4th, 1949, James E. Tedford, a veteran, became the third person to disappear mysteriously. He was a resident of the Bennington Sailors' Home at the time. Tedford had been in St. Albans visiting with relatives, and he was returning home on a local bus when he suddenly vanished. According to witnesses on the bus, Tedford got on the bus, and he was still on it by the last stop before they arrived in Bennington. At some point between the last stop and Bennington, Tedford seemingly disappeared into thin air. His belongings were still in the luggage rack, and there was an open bus schedule laying on the seat where he'd been sitting. He was not seen from that day on. Tedford vanished while the bus was traveling in the area where Paula had vanished. The big difference being she was walking along a trail while he was sitting on a bus. The proximity of the two disappearances was not noticed by authorities, but others did make the connection. The fourth person to go missing within the area was 8-year-old Paul Jeffson. October 12, 1950, Paul's mother drove from one side of their farm to the other in order to feed their pigs. His mother left Paul sitting in the truck while she dished out the food. For those of you that don't know, they can be dangerous. Pigs, that is. Small children should be kept away from them. Once the pigs had been fed, Paul's mother returned to the pickup. That was when she realized Paul was not there. She looked around and began calling his name. Then she began to worry. It had been about an hour since she'd seen him last. The authorities were called in, and they brought bloodhounds to try tracking the missing boy. The dogs followed the scent all the way to the edge of the highway. From there, the trail went cold. Like Paula, Paul was last seen wearing a bright red coat. October 28th, roughly 2 weeks after Paul Jeffson vanished, 53-year-old Frida Langer went out on a hike with her cousin Herbert Elsner. The two left their family campsite near the Somerset Reservation for a hike. At one point during the trek, Langer slipped and fell into a stream. Hiking in wet clothes can be a bother, so she told her cousin she was going to run back to camp, change, and come right back. Elsner said he would wait for her to get back. After waiting for his cousin to return, Elsner got to thinking that maybe something had held her up back in camp, so he decided to walk back. When he arrived, he was surprised to find Frida was not there. No one had seen her come back, and they had no idea where she might be. The family tried searching the area around their camp and sending a few people up the trail where the two cousins had last been together. When they could find no sign of Frida, the family contacted the sheriff's department. Over the next few weeks, hundreds of searchers combed the area. Aircraft flew over the area looking for the missing woman. Every trail was examined for anything that might tell where she had gotten. May 12, 1951, Langer's body was finally discovered near Somerset Reservoir, in an area that had been searched extensively 7 months earlier. Unfortunately, due to conditions in which her remains were found, no cause of death could be ascertained. This is a bizarre and common occurrence during mysterious disappearances. Someone goes missing. Searchers are brought in, and every conceivable spot is checked for the missing person. After a while, the missing person is found in a place searched by dozens of people who knew how to look for someone. On occasion, the missing person is found in an open area, like a trail or a roadway, where anyone walking within a dozen feet would have easily seen them. Yet, there they are in a place that had been searched over and over. There had been reports of strange lights in the sky, weird sounds with no explanation, and odd odors on the mountain, predating colonial settlement. These reports, combined with the many strange disappearances, have led to speculation about UFOs and maybe wormholes in the area. There's also something known as the Bennington Monster. Today, we would call him a Bigfoot. At the time, it was just called a monster. The creature stood well over 6 feet tall, and he was covered from head to toe in hair. The first written record of the monster was in the 1800s when the creature attacked a stagecoach. The coach was traveling along a dirt road, and the passengers all saw this thing come running from the woods. The coach driver tried to get the team of horses to outrun the monster, but it slammed into the stage, flipping it onto its side. A stagecoach weighs around 2,500 pounds. In order to knock one over, the monster must have weighed a lot. Either that, or it grabbed the coach and lifted it over onto its side. Either way, this monster must have been extremely strong. 1892, a sawmill worker, Henry McDowell, bludgeoned his co-worker to death with a rock after he had heard voices telling him he needed to attack this man. He was committed to an insane asylum, but he managed to escape and then vanish. The police and the sheriff's deputies searched the area, but they never found the escaped fugitive. 5 years after that murder, John Harbour, a prominent Woodford citizen, went into Bickford Hollow, just south of Glastonbury, in order to hunt. For unknown reasons, he was shot by some unknown assailant. When the body was examined by the police, they discovered it had been dragged through the woods for several yards from where the shooting had taken place. His loaded gun was set on the ground next to him. Those who investigated his death were left wondering why he was so easily shot when he had a fully loaded gun, and then why his assailants would bother to drag him through the bushes, then go back and get his rifle and bring that up and lay it on the ground next to him. The murder is just one more unsolved mystery from the Bennington Triangle. Tom Young and Keith Reinhard were both going through that dreaded midlife crisis. Both of these men rented the same rental space in the Silver Plum, Colorado, only they were a year apart. When Keith rented the space in the strip mall, he began hearing stories about the former renter, Tom, who had vanished mysteriously just a few months earlier. Keith thought the story would make a good novel, so he began researching Tom's life as his new project. Silver Plum is a quaint historic town in Clear Creek County, Colorado. Earlier settlers had hoped to strike gold, but they only managed to find a few clumps of this grayish ore, and they considered it worthless. The miners were about to give up and abandon the area when they discovered those worthless gray lumps were actually silver deposits, thus the name Silver Plum. In 1987, the town only had 200 residents. Tom Young was renting a space in the shopping center. One day, he went for a walk with his dog, and he never returned. The sheriff's department looked into the mystery, but they could find no reason to pursue the case. There were no signs of violence at his home or in the shop. Believe it or not, there's no law that says you have to tell anyone before you simply walk off the face of the earth. When the rent came due on the shopping center's owner, Ted Parker, emptied out the store and he put on a vacancy listing. Keith Reinhardt was a sports writer in Chicago, Illinois. He was growing tired of the day-to-day grind and had that old bucket list he wanted to deal with. His 50th birthday was getting close. Oh, what to do? Keith knew a guy that lived in Colorado, and he ran a small restaurant called the KP Cafe. The great outdoors were right outside his front door. That sounded so much better than living in the big city with the big city nonsense. Keith called his friend, Ted Parker, and asked if there was some place he might open an antique store. Ted told Keith he had a vacant store and he was happy to rent it to him. Keith told his wife he was going to get away from Chicago for a while and write the great novel. He needed to be alone so he could get his life back together. It would be easier to create while on his own in a small town. No distractions. The funny thing about people's problems, they usually are all their own manufacture. My dad used to say if all the problems in the world were hung on a tree, we would all pick our own. Geographical cures don't really work. Whatever the troubles are that make our life a mess will be right there when you unpack. Keith Reinhardt packed his bags, along with most of his problems, and moved to Silver Plum, Colorado, to restart his life. He soon heard about his predecessor, Tom. Running an antique store in a small town sounds idyllic until the rent comes due. Keith soon found that the customers were not flocking to his door. This was combined with his having a bad case of writer's block. That novel he was going to write was stuck in the dark recesses of his mind. Dean Koontz was on Coast to Coast late one night, one of my favorite writers. Dean said when he started a book, he has the opening scene, and that's it. He just writes the beginning and then lets the ideas come. He said he's as surprised by the outcome as the readers are. I thought that was really odd until I wrote my first novel. I was shocked how it ended. Keith sat there trying to unstick his mind. He thought about how Tom Young had vanished without a trace. The ideas got going. Keith was going to write a book based on Tom and his life. July 31st, 1988, local hunters were out combing the mountain wilderness looking for a deer or two. Approximately an hour's walk from Silver Plum, they found a skeleton propped up against a tree. Next to the skeleton was the remains of a dog. There was a backpack and a pistol on the ground by both bodies. It was Tom Young and his dog Gus. Both had a gunshot wound to the head. Folks in town decided the mystery was solved. Tom had gone into the woods to kill himself. No mystery there. Too bad Gus had died as well. During the mostly routine investigation, the authorities ran into a bit of a problem. The ballistics found on the two bullets did not match the pistol. The inside of each and every handgun has rifling, grooves that cause the bullet to spin as it flies so it will maintain a true flight. Even though these guns are made on an assembly line, each and every one is just slightly different. These grooves cut into the bullet, and they can cause matching lines so that they can tell which weapon the bullet came from. That's how the CSI guys do it. Ballistics. The word ballistics comes from an ancient Roman weapon called a ballista, which was a giant crossbow that could launch a steel arrow or a huge rock 500 yards and hit within inches of the aim point. Think about that, firing an arrow 5 football fields away and hitting the target. With no suspects to look into and nobody really pushing them, the sheriff's department declared the case of Tom Young closed. Keith had become somewhat obsessed by the story. Even after the bodies were found and the case closed, Keith continued trying to solve the deaths. Was it really a suicide, or was it simply made to look that way? A week after the bodies of Tom and Gus were found, Keith locked up his store early. He told Ted and anyone else he ran into he wanted to hike to Pendleton Mountain. Well, it was already getting into the afternoon. The hike would be about a 6-hour round trip. It would be dark before Keith got back, and most folks thought he was just saying he was heading to the mountain. Hiking in the woods at night was not a smart thing to do. There were bears and mountain lions who would not think twice about inviting Keith to dinner. A few people did see Keith as he walked towards the edge of town and into the tree line. They all said he wasn't carrying any kind of hiking gear. He did not have a backpack or any kind of cold weather stuff. If Keith was going to hike to the mountain, it was going to get cold. Folks just assumed he was only going to walk into the woods a short ways and then turn around and go home. If you go for a day trip into the woods or the wilderness, you should always take along supplies for a possible overnight stay. Things go wrong. You might get lost or twist an ankle. Once you can no longer make your way back to civilization, you'll need to survive for at least one night on your own. Do some research before you become a statistic. Food, water, something to make a fire. You should know how to make a fire without burning down the forest. You need wet weather gear, should packed away in your pack. Even if it doesn't look like it's going to rain, you want to have something to cover yourself if it does. I always carry an old army poncho and 4 or 5 bungee cords. If I need to get in and out of the rain, I can put up a hasty shelter. I have spent many a night sitting on the banks of the Rio Grande under my poncho as it rained all around me. The following morning, there was no sign of Keith Reinhardt. The Colorado Alpine Rescue Team launched a huge rescue operation using helicopters, search dogs, and many of the people from Silver Plum. After a week, authorities found nothing. Everyone knew that the rescue effort was not going to be easy. They finally called off the search on August 12, 1989, after a Cessna carrying two of the searchers crashed. Only one of the rescue team survived. When Keith was no longer expected to be alive, Ted went to Keith's home to begin the process of packing his things to ship them back to Chicago. In the dining room sat Keith's computer and some newspapers. The articles were all on the disappearance and subsequent discovery of Tom Young. On the computer was the draft of Keith's book. In the story was a passage that went, Keith Gypsum changed into some hiking boots and donned a heavy flannel shirt. He understood it all now and his motivations. Guy closed the door and then walked off towards the lush, shadowless Colorado forest above. Guy Gypsum was the character based on Tom Young. Keith had sent a letter home to his office saying when he got back to Chicago, he was going to get busy reporting on the Chicago Bulls. It didn't sound as if Keith was planning to vanish under his own power. The official report says Keith died due to misadventure. Not a suicide, just a series of bad decisions. Some decided Keith didn't die in the wilderness, but met up with somebody and moved away without telling anyone. At a party before his disappearance, Keith had been seen talking to some woman. The witness thinks her name was either Greta or Gretchen. The supposition is that the two made arrangements for Keith to walk away from his current life and begin anew at some unknown location. There's no evidence of this being true, but it is a possibility. If you listen to the show Disappearance from 2016, you'll have heard about how over 100 people have gone missing trying to track down Percy Fawcett, who vanished into the rainforests of Brazil. People think they've figured out the secret and they want to test their theory. This has led to a lot of others going missing. These two men in Colorado had one thing in common that is not lost on many. They were both renting the same shop in Silver Plum. Could there have been something to do with that one store that led to the two men being taken away? The shopping center is nothing much as far as its history. Ted Parker owns the place and he runs the KP Center, KP Cafe in the center. There was no suspicious activity. No mob bosses hanging around, no gambling in the back room. Nobody was fencing stolen property out of the place. Could there have been some paranormal connection? You don't have to have a murder in a building for it to become infested by spirits. There are what is called transient spirits that move about with no known reasoning. Might some kind of a hostile being taken a liking to that one shop and drove everybody renting it to wander off? Probably not, because nobody else had disappeared connection to the store since Keith, unless the being had finished its mission and then moved on. I find doing shows about people who go missing somewhat disturbing. Seeing a UFO or Bigfoot is a story to be shared. It gives you a new idea on how the world is around you. When somebody vanishes without a trace, it leaves a void in the world. If you know the person that is gone, you'll drive yourself crazy trying to figure out what happened to them and why. Every time you hear a knock at the door or the phone rings, you think, could this be the person trying to contact me at long last? If you have a haunted house, if you live in a place that you hear bumps and noises at night, contact the Laredo Paranormal Research Society at laredoparanormal@hotmail.com and they'll give you a free investigation. They'll let you know if you actually have a ghost in the house or just faulty pipes. Till next Saturday, this is Chris James for Strange Things.
Are you coming to the tree where they strung up a man, the same murder three? Strange things that happen here, how stranger would it be if we met at midnight in the hanging tree?